This is Candace Apple, and we're here at Phoenix and Dragon Bookstore in Sandy Springs.
And tell us about your pagan and Wiccan section, and how has that evolved over the years?
It has evolved, and we started 30 years ago this coming October. And at that time, the whole goal of the store was about celebrating the human spirit and all the diversity. So it's been interfaith, trans-spiritual, just including and embracing everyone. And so when I first opened, it was mostly books, and then a little crystals, and then a little jewelry, and then a little candles, and then a little incense, and looking for ways to help people with tools on their spiritual path. We don't proselytize any one path, but we're open to anyone working in the light in a positive way to impact their spiritual growth. That does a lot in the magic room of also educating the community. Sometimes people are afraid of the idea of witchcraft or Wiccans, or they don't even know what to think about it. And I usually try to talk to them about the whole goddess energy, the feminine energy that has become so much more alive and palpable on our earth over the last 30 years. We started right after the harmonic convergence. Was supposed to be a time of energy coming together for forward movement in our earth. And I started working on the store the day after. And at that point, we were up here in northeast section of Atlanta. Everybody's saying, why aren't you down in Little Five Points, where everybody's open to all these things? I said, well, that's because Crystal Blue's in Little Five Points. The Sphinx is downtown. There's nothing that says that people on the north side of town don't need someone to talk to and question and look for their path. And so I started off with bringing in books about goddesses, because that's sort of a gentle step into the pagan Wiccan traditions. A lot of people, especially when Joseph Campbell was being interviewed by Bill Moyer, it was right about the time we were opening, a little bit the year before, and talking about all the different faith traditions, from the Greeks to the Hindus, that have this energy of goddesses, which if you study, very often then became the same energy reflected in the Catholic Church. We had Carl McColman, who was a wonderful author, here for several years teaching about the Druids, and he specialized in Bridget, which was a peace goddess and a Celtic goddess, and she became Saint Bridget. So there's much transition through culture because it's a universal energy. It's an energy like an archetype, whether it's the Great Mother or whether it's the underworld. All different spiritual traditions have these energies that they work with and talk about in their life. So we started with goddesses and then started having more requests. We did tarot and other metaphysical tools that people use for tapping into their own intuition. And sometimes we didn't look at the pendulums, but pendulums are a simple way that people use. We talk about finding subtle energies, and very much of us know things, but we're not sure we know them. And you can ask a pendulum or ask a tarot card and get validation and awareness of the path that the answers you're looking for, or the answers you already know within. So we've had groups ever since, it must have been the first year. Ravenwood is a group of Wiccans. Now, Wiccans is a tradition that's actually fairly new as an organized religion. It is recognized as a religion, but in the earlier 1900s. So it's based on ancient pagan practices. Very often there's talk about the old wise woman, or she was the healer, or worked with herbs. And that would be the people that people would go to when they had health problems or spiritual problems. So it was a much less patriarchic, more matriarchal society in that structure. And then very much after some of the more traditional religions came, that feminine energy got buried and wasn't honored. And so this has been a revival of pairing the feminine and the balance of male and female. One day, after finishing a fairy tale about a princess reclaiming her magical powers, and I was stopped at a stoplight and said, what do I really want to do with my life? I had a vision of Phoenix and Dragon Bookstore. And that is the balance of yin and yang, male and female. So that's part of our exploration here, is how do you balance that in your spiritual life? And pagan and Wiccan traditions very well go with that. Also, when people are feeling a little afraid, oh, there are witches in there, and it's like, yes, like environmentalists. They honor the earth, they honor the seasons, they honor the male and the female of life. So
I started this project quite, I guess, confused between the difference, over the difference between pagan and Wiccan.
pagan's the big category.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Pagan's the big category. And so any religion that is not a singular god, that has different deities, whether it's Hindu or Celtic paganism or Native American, that would all go under that umbrella. And then Wiccan is generally more structured, and there's a bit hierarchical because you are being trained by someone that's more advanced. And some people like that because it gives you some confidence in what you're being taught. And other peoples have balked at their own churches and religions, and they want to be freer to just make up their mind how they're going to do things. So that tends to be people that don't specifically identify as Wiccan but may identify as pagan. Have you talked to other people that
I have. Well, of course, I've talked to Willa Dragonstone, and then the people that's, and I haven't had an opportunity to go and do more interviews, but I've already registered for Mystic South.
Oh, great.
So I'm going to probably do one set of shows, and then, depending what happens, hopefully in October or after Pagan Pride, roll out another series.
Right.
That is my hope. So how has the section, I was just going to change it here, how would you say that the section of products grown? I mean, you've got an extensive collection of the different gods and goddesses from the Norse, the Greek, the Egyptian, etc. Have you observed or witnessed people beginning to explore beyond maybe some of the, more traditional, whatever traditional?
Well, there's a lot of interest in Egypt, which again is another, would qualify under the pagans, but it's not related to Wiccan. But there's also a lot of talk about the Eastern religions and Egyptian and esoteric, which means ancient knowledge, where the talk of when Jesus was disappeared, where did he go? Who did he learn with? And so there's lots of interconnections between different spiritual groups.
And who are some that you pointed out, and I would love you to reflect again on this, who are some of the major thinkers or writers on the topic of pagan practice, ritual, thought?
Well, we mentioned Dorothy Morrison, and she will be coming to Atlanta. Orion Foxwood speaks on the fairy tradition, and he's taught here at the store before, and we actually did class out in the woods. Where else? In a fairy circle. And I've just forgotten Cunningham's first name. Cunningham has a tradition. Also, people think of witches as being in covens, but that's not necessarily required. There can be solitary practitioners, and there are actually books that are written to sort of help them learn how to work within their tradition without being in a group or a coven.
And I was also interested, there was like a Kabbalah or Kabbalah section that
right.
had.
And the interesting thing about the word Kabbalah is there are 3 different spellings. One's for the Judaic tradition, one's for the Christian tradition, and one's for the magical tradition. And so that comes up through the Golden Dawn tradition, is one that addresses the Kabbalah a lot. Some of the high magic addresses that. And one of the popular new modern writers, Christopher Penzick, does a lot of large collection of his books.
Now you mentioned magic, and then in terms of a pagan or Wiccan practice, what does magic mean? How would you?
Well, how I would define it would be focusing your energy. As we sort of know from science, everything is energy. It might seem hard. That means the energy is moving more slowly. People talk about words being energy, and that can help. Careful what you say, it might happen. And when people get a little afraid of magic, I go, oh, so you've never blown out the candles on your birthday cake? That's magic. You make a wish on a star. It's putting your intent focused out into the universe. And as we sometimes notice, people that focus on the negative in their life a lot and whine and grouch a lot somehow seem to have a lot of that more happen in their life. And amazingly, when you can shift that energy into a positive, what you want to create, and instead of focusing on the bad things that happened in the past that hold you back, good things tend to happen. And so part of magic is defining that process and focusing that process. Lots of people get scared of witches for lots of reasons. They're going to turn me into a toad. And one of the traditions is what goes around comes around. So any witch would not send out bad energy to someone because it would just come back. And sometimes threefold or 1,000-fold, they say. So it's one of those things, anything can be perverted. Any religion, psychology, philosophy, for power. And if someone gets into a trip about power, they might want to turn someone into a toad. Maybe any of us have had that day when we wanted to turn somebody into a toad, but we don't act on that. So I think when we talk about do unto others as you would have them do unto you, that's a tradition in the Christian faith and the Jewish faith and 21 major religions. Well, what comes around goes around is part of that tradition, because you're putting out there what you hope to come back to you, and it shouldn't be negative.
That is exactly the message I personally needed to hear today. Just personally, thank you. I've been in kind of a negative funk sort of thing, and I was like, well, why am I pushing myself to go to get on 400 North and sit in traffic? Thank you. You said exactly what I needed to hear today.
I had one happen today about how your thoughts and words are powerful. Now, you can always say coincidence, or maybe it was just a lesson I had to hear about how powerful thoughts can be. I had a vendor call, and they had a back order, and they weren't going to ship for 2 weeks. And did I want my other part of the order now? I said, no, just ship in 2 weeks, fine. Well, do you want to give me your credit card now? I said, well, I might as well. As I'm reading the card, what went through my head was, unless it gets compromised before 2 weeks and the number's not good anymore. Within 2 hours, we looked on the credit card and it had been compromised this afternoon. So am I psychic and I knew it had happened because it had happened a little bit earlier, but did that thought or that fear at least told me that's not the way to be focusing. Or maybe it also told me be aware, and it made us look in the credit card. There can be different ways to interpret messages, but we get messages if we look for them.
It's interesting. Someone did once say to me that coincidence was, she used the word God, God's way of remaining anonymous.
Mm-hmm. That's a good way of putting it.
Magic,
Yeah.
Some of the ritual objects, the altar objects, I think it's interesting to me that they can be bought at a store. I don't know if they need to be blessed by anyone, or if there's any.
I tell people ask me about their crystals, and they go, I have to cleanse it. How do I cleanse it? I said, well, some people like to put them in salt water, but don't put your porous ones in salt water. Some people like to put them in a running stream, but make sure they don't just float away. Some people like to put them under moonlight. Some people like to put them under sunlight. My teacher taught me you can take your crystal or any object you want to bless and turn it away from you and use your breath. You always have your breath. Then if you want to instill your purpose in it, you turn it towards you and blow. So that's something we have with us all the time. And even when people are coming to purchase things, I'll tell them, yes, here's a lovely pendulum that can help you douse and tell you a yes and no answer and help you look at subtle energies, subtle answers that you know inside of you but haven't bubbled up to the surface yet. And it may be $10 or $20 or $30, or you can go home and get a piece of string and tie it around a little bolt and just dangle it and use it. There's old traditions of midwives checking for boy or girl with a needle tied and putting it over the mother's stomach. That's dowsing. Dowsing with dowsing rods or sticks for water. I mean, those are all old practices that have been used over the years.
And the objects themselves, you mentioned this when we were by the crystals, with likening it to the shovel. I was wondering if you might repeat that in case I didn't come out well.
For me, it's very important to remember that these are just tools. And if people say, what does that crystal do? My basic response will be, it doesn't do anything. Or it just sits there until you pick it up, at which point it helps you focus your energy. My personal belief is that if we do prayer or magic or affirmations, any of those things that we put out to the universe, if we just get scattered and forget our focus, it takes the affirmation of the magic, but it also takes action. And so the focus of the tools are to help you stay conscious, help you stay aware, help you not drift into your self-sabotage, be mindful of what you're doing right then and there. And the different colors, the different scents, all these are things that are ways that nature can help us stay focused.
And I would say, and if you will validate or not, that the pagan tradition, the Wiccan tradition, is much more in some ways earthbound than...
Environmentalists connected to the earth.
Yeah.
And very concerned about care of the earth and treasuring the earth because it is our mother. In my personal belief system, our awareness that could bring peace and happiness to the whole world is that we are all connected. And we're connected with the earth, we're connected with the animals, we're connected with other faith traditions, other people over on the other side of the world. We had an art exchange for peace, and we were paired with a Druid group in Australia. And it was wonderful, but then I certainly started thinking about it. It's like, well, when we're having winter solstice, they're having summer solstice. And I'd never even thought about it, and that we can be, and I'm sort of like, well, is it hot when you have winter solstice? And it's like, yeah. So you don't think about the opposites of what are happening with their actual world.
And I guess I'm curious, how would you define your own spirituality? Do you put a label on it anywhere?
Well, I finally found a label. Yay, we all need labels sometimes. Self-definition. Mirabai Starr mentioned it. It's trans-spiritual. I believe there's a well of spirit. I believe we're all on paths to it. They may be different paths, but we're all going to the same well. And it's where we get our strength and our spirit from. And that's part of one doesn't have to be altruistic to be kind and loving to all different people, because if we really are connected, should we hurt someone else, we're hurting ourselves. And that's the core of my belief system. And it's not like I want a melting pot. I don't think we should all just, well, it's all the same, so don't be Jewish and don't be Christian and don't be Muslim. No, those traditions are precious as they've been part of someone's ancestry. I think we mentioned as we were in the Egyptian section in the Day of the Dead, people are focusing on ancestry and how that more than just the DNA is brought forward, or the DNA brings forward spiritual traditions, and it's important. We've had Native American speakers say, you don't need to dress up in feathers and do smudge. Find your own tradition first. And there's indigenous. Indigenous is the people that lived here, and they were everywhere on Earth before different cultures got imposed upon them. So find your Celtic tradition, find your Norse tradition. I'm Pennsylvania Dutch tradition. And one of our teachers here, Sandra Amos, who will be at Mystic South this summer, was talking about hoodoo. And it's the magic from the Appalachians. And it was a blend of Pennsylvania's Dutch migrating, the Scotch, and then the Native American. And I've grown up in the Pennsylvania Dutch family, and here I am in metaphysics, and it never tied together that besides hex signs, there was a very rich magical tradition there. Now I know. Our family always talked about hex signs like art and folk art and maybe some superstition, but didn't realize there are whole books of German magic that are behind all this information.
And then even when you were walking through the store, you mentioned Italian Wiccans having their, or pagan Wiccans
Wiccans
having their altar in a
sewing kit, because very often people needed to use symbols. Even the tarot were symbols to hide the deeper meaning. It was just, could be a deck of cards would have the symbols in them. And the strega, the Italian witches, could fold out their sewing kit, and there'd be your altar cloth, would be the little pouch unfolded, and then there'd be an athame from the scissors for cutting and making the circle, and there'd be the needle, which would be a wand, and there would be a thimble, which would be the chalice, and there you have your altar. And sometimes when people see athames, they're the sword object or the ritual object, it's like, oh, that's scary, what are they doing? Well, you always create a circle, and that's your sacred space. And I think that's maybe also what's different with pagans and witches. The sacred space can be outside in the woods. It doesn't have to have a church, but they're really honoring all space as sacred. But then when you make intent, you make that circle, and you have your ceremony, and then you let go of the circle and close it.
But what's so powerful also about a circle is there's no hierarchy.
Right.
Yeah, which is, and I know there's an altar in many times, or from what I've observed, people do conduct ritual from that area. Right. But I find it so egalitarian,
right.
to worship, to be together and engage spirit in a certain way. I'm sure there are tons of other questions I probably should be asking, but just
some of the things I can think of, because something you mentioned brought it up. We're finding a lot more young people are being open in interest to searching their spiritual path. Very often it goes from traditional upbringings to maybe the pagan tradition, maybe the Buddhist tradition. But I have noticed over the 30 years our major customer base used to be 40-year-old women, and it started opening up to some men and cultural diversity, and now age diversity too.
So younger people, more millennials, you think, or even younger?
A lot of millennials, yeah.
20s.
Yeah, in the 20s. Yeah. It used to be people would go to college, get their job, get married, have the kids, have the car, have the house, and then there'd be a crisis, or maybe just an emptiness. It may not even take a crisis. But more towards their 40s, we're starting to run into, what's this really about? Why am I really here? And I'm finding more and more millennials in their 20s going, why am I really here? What do I really want to do with my life? And instead of just accepting, well, this is what I have to do next because that's what's expected.
Yeah, I think they've seen a lot of their parents just go, oh,
Yeah.
It's not all it's cracked up to be. Yeah, I'm an empty nester officially after Saturday. My youngest graduated.
Wow.
And that's brought up a lot of things, a lot.
Yeah,
Trying to be compassionate with myself about that.
And I read an article recently by a millennial that said, is some study that 4% of millennials are going to church. And he's writing to the churches, I love Jesus, I still want to be in the church, but pay some attention to us and what our needs are and what our abilities are to contribute. And it was almost like it was a tradition that was just fading into whoever had been there forever and wasn't really connecting. And but there are lots of young authors that are. We had a wonderful gentleman named Timber, and he brings the Buddhist tradition to younger folks. And even the Course in Miracles, which is a channel piece, but there's a young woman named Gabrielle, and she brings that forward. So there are young authors sort of retranslating many different traditions into a more modern outlook.
I mean, maybe the concept of the American dream is also changing too, and for some people. Like having the house and the car and all that is in some ways contributed to the environmental degradation that we're witnessing.
Which is another appeal. And even into all that, vegetarianism and vegans come in, because again, that's respect for the animals, respect for us not being in dominion and being on a more equal basis.